When beginning to understand the mutualist perspective on political economy, it always seems vital to start with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's 1846 System of Economic Contradictions, or alternatively, the philosophy of poverty. In it, Proudhon elaborates upon how the antagonisms present in value give rise to capitalist horrors such as poverty and exploitation. It is with this text that we can understand value within the context of both oppressive and free societies. Proudhon begins by setting in opposition to one another value in use, or intrinsic value, and value in exchange, or of opinion. Proudhon says that if we were to have an infinite array of use values, then we would have ensured welfare without having to labor a day in his life. In such a state of affairs, he has all that is useful to him. Yet for Proudhon, this negates the possibility of value. Because value is essentially a social relation, it is only through exchange that we can acquire any notion of utility. It is quite clear that utility is a necessary condition for exchange. After all, why would anyone want to exchange that which has no utility? Yet vice versa, exchange is a necessary condition for utility. It is here where Proudhon identifies the first economic contradiction. Since all of us live only by labor and exchange, and grow richer as production and exchange increase, each of us produces as much useful value as possible in order to increase by that amount his exchanges and consequently his enjoyments. Well, the first effect, the inevitable effect of the multiplication of values, is to lower them. The more abundant an article of merchandise, the more it loses in exchange and depreciates commercially. Is it not true that there is a contradiction between the necessity of labor and its results? This reveals to us the methodology which Proudhon wishes to employ. Proudhon, through his knowledge of German idealism, works to understand the contradictions at play when we speak of the economy. In the previous example, use value has drastically exceeded exchange value, yet we also want to look at what happens when the opposite occurs, which is when exchange value exceeds use value. It is in these cases where the producer benefits whilst the consumer suffers. Take instances of artificial scarcity in which a monopolist can raise prices all they want on a specific good or service. The consumer is forced to pay the absurd sum or abstain from the good or service altogether. Whilst Proudhon previously highlighted the mutual dependency of use and exchange value, he also stresses their mutual exclusion, or at least a tendency to mutually exclude each other. Yet these two opposing aspects of value demand a look into their synthesis, constituted value. All of wealth is always and firstly produced through labor. Labor is an always present force which can differ in quality and quantity. Simple in its formula, yet infinite in modification. Society produces an infinitude of objects which provide well being, differing in quantity, quality, and proportion. In fact, society shall strive in its products the greatest amount of well being, making quantity, quality, and proportion the three factors determining all wealth. Of course, throughout the procurement of such objects, labor will always have to be expended. Prometheus is careful to note the time and trouble taken in this labor. Throughout his process, which lasts throughout his life, he is subject to many disappointments. Now, perhaps by technique or machinery, Prometheus can produce in one day as much as he previously could in 10. His commodity's degree of importance in the process of valuation has suddenly shifted. Why? Because of labor. Thus, value varies, and the law of value is unchangeable. Further, if value is susceptible of variation, it is because it is governed by a law whose principle is essentially inconstant, namely labor measured by time. What is relevant here are the specific costs of production by which the price of reproducible commodities are able to be determined. Now keep in mind that I say reproducible commodities, thereby excluding objects such as rare statues and fine wines as provided by David Ricardo. For it is these goods which have their value determined by virtue of their scarcity alone, not labor. It is always a mistaken attack on the labor theory of value to point to such goods, because the classical economists and socialists have already accounted for such affairs. Now, because Proudhon has established a necessity for a commodity's value in exchange, we must understand how such commodities fluctuate on the market relative to their production cost. This is vital to the constitution of value and is only hindered by the absence of competition and liberty in the market. The effects of this struggle are well known: the wars of commerce and of the market, obstructions to business, stagnation, prohibition, the massacres of competition, monopoly, reduction of wages, laws fixing maximum prices, the crushing inequality of fortunes, misery. All of these result from the antinomy of value. What constituted or synthetic value does is ensure that the price of reproducible commodities tend toward their cost of production, which boils down to labor, whilst excluding that which is unnecessary. This does away with the criticism was often levied against Proudhon by both liberals and Marxists alike, in which he is falsely framed as suggesting a system of labor notes. These supposed notes would fix prices solely at their labor time, thus allowing for someone to spend a necessary amount of time laboring, benefiting at the expense of the honest. This misunderstanding likely originates from Marx's aptly named the poverty of philosophy, in which Proudhon's position is conflated with a more obscure British socialist named Mr. Bray. This conflation could perhaps be due to Proudhon's acceptance that a commodity's natural price was equivalent to the labor required to produce it, and if labor cannot find its reward in its own product, then it shall be promptly abandoned. However, it is important to note that goods do not necessarily need to be sold, nor must labor be paid. This is in direct contradiction to the labor notes ascribed to him via Marx. This has undeniably tarnished many people's understanding of Proudhon and mutualism altogether. When we speak of constituted value, we necessarily also speak of competition. As long as a product is supplied only by a single manufacturer, its real value remains a mystery, either through the producer's misrepresentation or through his neglect or inability to reduce the cost of production to its utmost limit, to which both the state socialists and capitalists cannot resolve within their own given systems. For state socialism abolishes reciprocal liberty, whilst the capitalists continually exploit the laborers through the persistent conquest of profit. Within capitalism, the tension between use and exchange value is clearly demonstrated through the working class needing to constantly produce use values for their own subsistence. Meanwhile, the capitalists are abstaining from consumption in order to expand production, valorization. The very nature of the capitalist mode of production establishes a disjunction between production and consumption, which is precisely what mutualism seeks to unify. This is why long run profit is often regarded as theft, synonymous with plunder. It can only occur from a hierarchical system maintained through privilege. If the means of production are excluded to the capitalists, then the working class has no choice but to defer themselves to these capitalists. Hierarchy is therefore essential for wage labor. Of course, Josiah Warren is being much more prescriptive when he says that cost is to be the limit of price. But Proudhon allows us to understand this from a descriptive lens. Constituted value is defined as the synthesis between use and exchange value as both reach a harmony. In Kantian fashion, Proudhon has investigated the necessary conditions for value and the harmony paradoxically found in its antinomy. All of this begs the question of how constituted value revolutionizes society once it is no longer obscured by coercive systems. Whilst there is nothing predetermined for destiny, is always and everywhere a mere fantasy, we can understand that capitalist profits would be abolished alongside interests which serve as usury. The former occurs when the natural wage of labor is realized to be its product, whilst the latter occurs through mutual credit schemes. In this way, workers will be able to easily finance their own productive efforts, divorcing themselves from the necessity of the employer employee relationship which exists under capitalism. Of course, I imagine the wiser mutualists rubbing their foreheads as they properly understand mutualism in a pluralistic manner, allowing for the creation of new forms of distribution relative to the demands and material circumstances of different communities. This is why many mutualists present themselves as both market anarchists and enthusiasts of gift economies. Similar to how we understand constituted value, it is to emerge from mutual interactions, in which inequality of authority is present. It is never through an a priori judgment. This has always been crucial to understanding mutualism. Especially with its revival in the previous decades, it appears to have great potential for other creativity. Translators and scholars alike are still uncovering the literature and playing with the concepts themselves, inventing new ones. And constituted value seems to be an excellent start.